Have you ever wondered why some people seem to see meaning where others only see coincidence? Why certain minds notice a pattern in events that everyone else dismisses as random chance? The ancient Greek philosophers had a word for the specific faculty they believed made this kind of seeing possible. They called it nous. To them, nous was not simply intelligence, in the ordinary sense of quick calculation or clever argument. It was something deeper and considerably more rare. It was the capacity to perceive the hidden order behind visible things, to recognize the deeper pattern beneath the surface of ordinary experience, and to live in genuine harmony with the greater intelligence that the Greeks believed quietly organized the entire universe. Most people, then and now, never develop this capacity. They live entirely inside the ordinary thinking mind, the mind that reacts, compares, worries, and repeats the same patterns of interpretation without ever questioning where those patterns came from. This audiobook is about the specific difference between that ordinary thinking mind and the deeper faculty the ancients called nous, and about what becomes available to you the moment you learn to stop thinking like everyone else around you. Across the chapters ahead, you will explore what the ancient Greeks actually meant by nous, and why they considered it so different from ordinary knowledge. You will discover the specific difference between wisdom and information, and why the wisest teachers of the ancient world valued genuine understanding over mere certainty. You will examine the hidden order that Plato, Aristotle, and the broader philosophical tradition believed runs beneath both nature and the human mind. And you will learn practical ways to begin quieting the noisy, reactive, crowd-following mind so that this older and deeper intelligence can finally be heard. If you are enjoying this audiobook and want to discover the ancient art of thinking beyond the crowd, so you can finally see the deeper patterns shaping your life, subscribe to this channel now. More chapters are coming, and each one will guide you closer to the timeless wisdom of nous and what it can awaken in your own mind. Chapter 1. The mind everyone shares and the mind almost no one uses. Most people spend their entire lives inside a mind they never chose. This mind was handed to them slowly, over years, by parents, teachers, neighbors, and the general noise of the culture around them. It tells them what to want, what to fear, what counts as success, and what counts as failure. It repeats the same worries every morning and the same regrets every night. It is efficient in its own limited way because it never has to think anything new. It simply recycles what it has already been given. The ancient Greeks had a specific name for this ordinary, reactive, borrowed way of thinking. They called it a doxa, which means common opinion. The shared and largely unexamined beliefs that pass from person to person like a cold passed around a crowded room. Almost everyone lives inside doxa. Very few people ever step outside of it long enough to ask where their own thoughts actually came from. Doxa is not evil, and it is not stupid. It is simply automatic. It allows people to function without constantly reinventing their understanding of the world from scratch. The problem is not that doxa exists. The problem is that most people mistake doxa for their own genuine thinking. They believe the opinions running through their heads are truths they personally discovered, when in fact those opinions are simply the accumulated residue of everything they have absorbed from other people. Plato described this condition with his famous image of prisoners chained inside a cave, watching shadows on a wall and believing the shadows are the whole of reality. The prisoners are not foolish. They simply have never turned around to look at what is casting the shadows in the first place. Most human beings, ancient and modern, live exactly this way, mistaking the shadow of thought for the substance of genuine understanding. The ancient philosophers believed that beyond this ordinary mind of shared opinion, there existed a deeper and considerably more rare faculty of the human soul. They called it nous. Where doxa simply repeats what it has received, nous perceives directly. Where doxa argues from assumption to assumption, nous grasps the underlying pattern in a single act of genuine insight. The philosopher Aristotle described nous as the part of the soul capable of apprehending first principles, the foundational truths that cannot themselves be proven through argument, because they are the very ground from which all argument proceeds. You cannot argue your way to nous. You can only quiet the noise of doxa long enough for nous to become audible. This distinction between the mind that merely repeats and the mind that genuinely perceives is the foundation on which this entire audiobook is built. Consider how differently these two faculties operate in an ordinary moment of daily life. Someone loses their job unexpectedly. The mind of doxa immediately reaches for the shared cultural script. This is a disaster. This proves I am not good enough. Everyone will see me as a failure. These thoughts arrive instantly and feel completely convincing because they are simply borrowed from the collective anxiety of the surrounding culture. The mind of nous, when it is genuinely accessible, sees something entirely different in the same event. It notices the deeper pattern, perhaps the specific way this loss is quietly redirecting a life that had grown stagnant, or the specific opportunity now available that would have been impossible while the old position remained secure. Now does not deny the real difficulty of the situation. It simply sees further into it, past the panic of the crowd, and into the actual shape of what is unfolding. The specific reason nous is so rarely accessed is not that it is hidden away in some distant or difficult place. It is rarely accessed because doxa is so loud and so constant that it drowns nous out almost completely. The ordinary mind chatters from the moment you wake until the moment you fall asleep, filled with comparisons, worries, and the specific opinions of everyone else who has ever spoken into your life. Now, by contrast, is quiet. It does not compete for your attention. It waits patiently beneath the surface noise for the specific moments when the chatter finally settles enough for it to be heard. This is precisely why the ancient philosophers placed such enormous value on silence, solitude, and contemplative practice. These were not decorative spiritual habits. They were the specific practical technology through which the noise of doxa could be reduced enough for nous to finally speak. Heraclitus, one of the earliest Greek philosophers to write about this deeper intelligence, made a specific and striking observation about the people of his own time. He said that although the logos, the deeper rational order of the universe, is common to all, most people live as though they had a private understanding of their own. In other words, most people are so completely absorbed in their own personal version of doxa that they never notice the larger, shared, genuinely intelligent order running beneath everything. Heraclitus was not describing ancient Greece alone. He was describing a specific and permanent feature of human psychology that is just as true today as it was 25 centuries ago. The crowd thinks it is thinking independently. In reality, it is simply echoing itself. The specific promise embedded in this audiobook's title, that everything you want becomes available the moment you stop thinking like everyone else, is not a promise of easy magic. It is a precise description of a genuine mechanism. The mind of Doxa generates a narrow, fearful, comparison-driven version of reality. And from that narrow version, narrow choices and narrow results naturally follow. The mind of Nous generates a wider, clearer, pattern-aware version of reality. And from that wider perception, considerably wider possibilities become visible and available. This is not mysticism divorced from practical consequence. It is the direct and observable relationship between the specific quality of a mind's perception and the specific quality of the life that perception generates. Change the perceiving faculty, and the perceived world changes with it. This first chapter has been an invitation to notice the difference between these two minds within your own daily experience. Over the course of an ordinary day, you will have thousands of thoughts, and the overwhelming majority of them will be doxa, the borrowed, automatic, crowd-shaped noise that runs constantly in the background. Somewhere within that noise, however, brief moments of genuine nous are also occurring. Quiet flashes of direct insight that arrive without argument and without borrowed opinion. Learning to notice the difference between these two qualities of thought, simply noticing at first, without trying to force anything, is the entire beginning of the path this audiobook is inviting you onto. The chapters ahead will deepen this distinction and offer specific, practical ways of gradually shifting the balance so that the quiet, clear intelligence of Nous can finally be given the room it has always deserved. Chapter 2. What the ancient Greeks actually meant by nous. The word nous appears throughout ancient Greek philosophy, but its meaning shifted and deepened as thinker after thinker refined the concept across several centuries. In the earliest Greek usage, nous simply meant something like perception or mind, the general capacity to notice and understand. By the time Anaxagoras was writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, nous had become something considerably more specific and more cosmic. Anaxagoras proposed that nous was the ordering principle of the entire universe, the intelligent force that arranged the raw material of existence into the specific patterns and structures we now call nature. Before Anaxagoras, the universe was often described as a chaotic mixture. Anaxagoras insisted that something intelligent had to be responsible for the specific order visible everywhere, from the movement of the stars to the growth of a single seed into a specific and predictable plant. Plato inherited this cosmic understanding of nous and gave it a specific and more personal dimension. In Plato's philosophy, nous is the highest faculty of the human soul, the part capable of direct contact with what he called the forms, the eternal and unchanging patterns that lie behind every changing appearance in the physical world. Where the eyes perceive a specific, beautiful object, nous perceives beauty itself, the eternal pattern that every specific beautiful thing merely participates in and reflects. Where the eyes perceive a specific just action, nous perceives justice itself, the timeless standard against which every specific act of justice is measured. For Plato, the entire purpose of philosophy was the specific gradual turning of the soul away from the shifting shadows of ordinary sense experience and toward the stable light that nous alone is capable of perceiving. Aristotle, Plato's most famous student took this understanding and made it even more precise and more practically grounded. Aristotle distinguished between several different capacities of the human mind, and he reserved the term nous specifically for the capacity to grasp first principles directly, without the need for step-by-step argument. You can reason your way from one premise to another through careful logic, and Aristotle valued this kind of reasoning enormously. But the very first premises, the foundational truths from which all reasoning begins, cannot themselves be reached through further reasoning. They must be grasped directly in a single act of genuine intellectual perception. This direct grasping is what Aristotle meant by nous, and he considered it the highest and most godlike capacity available to human beings because it was the one point at which the human mind touched something genuinely eternal and unchanging. It is worth pausing here to notice how different this ancient understanding of intelligence is from the way intelligence is usually discussed today. Contemporary culture tends to measure intelligence through speed, through the ability to process information quickly, through test scores and clever arguments and rapid problem solving. The ancient Greeks certainly valued sharpness of mind, but they placed an even higher value on something quieter and deeper, the specific capacity to perceive genuine order and genuine truth beneath the surface of appearances. A person could be extremely quick and clever in the Greek understanding and still be almost entirely governed by doxa, the shallow opinion of the crowd, if they had never developed genuine access to nous. Cleverness without nous, in this ancient framework, produces exactly the kind of restless, anxious, comparison-driven life that so many quick and capable people quietly suffer through today. The Stoic philosophers who developed their own school several generations after Plato and Aristotle absorbed this understanding of nous and connected it directly to their concept of the logos, the rational intelligence they believed permeated and organized the entire cosmos. For the Stoics, human reason was understood as a specific fragment or spark of this larger universal logos, meaning that genuine human thinking, at its very best, was not separate from the intelligence running through nature itself, but was a direct participation in it. This is why the Stoics placed such enormous emphasis on living according to nature. They did not mean simply following animal instinct. They meant aligning the small individual mind with the larger cosmic mind, allowing the specific intelligence of nous to guide behavior instead of the narrow, fearful, self-protective reactions of the ordinary ego. There is a specific and important distinction worth making clear at this point. The distinction between nous and mere intuition, as it is casually understood today. Modern culture sometimes uses the word intuition to describe any sudden hunch or gut feeling, including hunches that arise from fear, from wishful thinking, or from simple bias. The ancient understanding of nous was considerably more disciplined than this. Nous was not casual guessing. It was the specific product of a mind that had been genuinely trained through long practice in contemplation, careful observation, and honest self-examination to perceive clearly rather than to react automatically. A person could certainly have flashes of genuine nous without any formal training. But the ancient philosophers believed these flashes became more frequent, more reliable, and more trustworthy through specific, sustained inner discipline. The specific practical implication of this ancient teaching for anyone living in the modern world is considerable. If nous is a genuine faculty of the human mind, distinct from ordinary borrowed opinion, then it follows that this faculty can be cultivated, strengthened, and increasingly relied upon, in much the same way that a physical skill can be developed through consistent practice. This is precisely the claim this audiobook is making, and precisely the reason the chapters ahead will move from ancient philosophical description toward specific, practical, and genuinely usable methods for accessing this deeper intelligence in the middle of an ordinary modern life. The ancient Greeks did not consider nous a rare gift reserved only for a handful of extraordinary philosophers. They considered it the birthright of every human soul, simply buried in most people beneath layer after layer of unexamined opinion. As this chapter closes, it is worth sitting for a moment with the sheer scale of what the ancient philosophers were claiming. They were claiming that behind the visible, changing surface of the world, there exists a genuine and intelligible order, and that the human mind possesses a specific faculty uniquely suited to perceiving that order directly. This is not a small or casual claim. It is one of the most ambitious ideas ever proposed about the nature of human consciousness and its relationship to reality itself. And yet, as ambitious as the claim is, the ancient philosophers insisted it was also intensely practical, because a mind that has genuinely learned to perceive the deeper order of things makes better decisions, suffers less needless anxiety, and moves through life with a specific clarity that the noisy, reactive mind of doxa can never provide. The chapters ahead will show you exactly how the ancients believed this clarity could be reached, and how you can begin reaching for it yourself, starting today. Chapter 3. Wisdom is not the same thing as knowledge. It is entirely possible to know an enormous number of facts and still possess almost no genuine wisdom. This distinction, so obvious once it is stated plainly, is one that modern culture consistently blurs and confuses. Schools measure and reward the accumulation of knowledge, the specific ability to recall dates, formulas, definitions, and procedures. This kind of knowledge is genuinely useful, and no serious thinker would dismiss its value entirely. But the ancient Greek philosophers were careful to distinguish this accumulated information from something considerably deeper, which they called Sophia, or wisdom. Sophia was not simply knowing more things. It was the specific capacity to see how things genuinely fit together, to perceive the deeper relationships and proportions that give isolated facts their actual meaning and significance within the larger whole. Socrates, perhaps more than any other ancient philosopher, built his entire life's work around this specific distinction. He famously claimed to know that he knew nothing, a statement that has puzzled readers for centuries, because Socrates clearly possessed enormous learning and remarkable insight. What Socrates actually meant was considerably more precise than simple ignorance. He meant that he had not mistaken the accumulation of opinions and information for genuine wisdom, the way so many of his fellow Athenians, particularly the confident professional teachers of his day, so easily did. Socrates spent his life questioning people who were certain they possessed wisdom, and he consistently discovered that their certainty rested on unexamined assumptions rather than on genuine understanding. His specific gift was not that he knew more than everyone else. It was that he understood, more clearly than almost anyone around him, exactly how much genuine understanding still remained beyond his grasp. This distinction between knowledge and wisdom maps directly onto the distinction this audiobook has already introduced between doxa and nous. Knowledge, in its ordinary accumulated form, belongs largely to the realm of doxa. It can be memorized, repeated, and passed from person to person without ever being genuinely understood at a deeper level. A person can recite an enormous number of facts about human psychology, for example, while still reacting to their own emotions with exactly the same blind, automatic patterns they have always used. Wisdom, or Sophia, belongs to the realm of nous. It cannot simply be memorized and repeated, because it is not a collection of separate facts. It is a specific quality of perception, a way of seeing the deeper pattern and proportion running through experience. And this kind of seeing can only be developed through genuine inner cultivation rather than mere information gathering. Aristotle offered one of the most practically useful frameworks for understanding this difference through his concept of phronesis, often translated as practical wisdom. Phronesis, for Aristotle, was the specific capacity to perceive what the right action actually is in a particular, concrete, unrepeatable situation. A capacity that cannot be reduced to a fixed set of rules memorized in advance. Two people might know all the same ethical rules and principles, and yet only one of them might possess the genuine phronesis needed to apply those principles wisely in a messy, ambiguous, real-life situation that does not match any textbook example. This is precisely why Aristotle considered phronesis a mark of genuine maturity rather than simple education. It develops slowly through the accumulated experience of actually living, reflecting honestly, and gradually refining one's own perception through trial, error, and genuine self-correction. The specific danger of mistaking mere knowledge for genuine wisdom is one that deserves careful attention, because this particular mistake causes an enormous amount of quiet suffering in modern life. A person can read every book available on a given subject, whether it concerns relationships, finances, health, or personal growth, and still make the exact same painful mistakes again and again, simply because information alone does not automatically produce the deeper perceptual shift that genuine wisdom requires. This is why so many people feel a persistent, nagging gap between what they intellectually know they should do and what they actually repeatedly do. The gap is not a failure of information. It is a failure of nous, a failure of the deeper perceiving faculty that alone can translate abstract knowledge into genuinely lived understanding. The ancient philosophical schools understood this gap clearly, and this understanding is precisely why they built their entire educational approach around practices very different from simple information transfer. The Platonic Academy and the Aristotelian Lyceum were not primarily lecture halls where facts were delivered to passive students. They were communities of sustained dialogue, careful questioning, and disciplined contemplative practice, all specifically designed to cultivate the deeper perceptual capacity of nous, rather than simply filling students with memorized content. The Socratic method itself, the practice of patient, probing questioning rather than direct instruction, was a deliberate technique for helping another person notice the gap between their borrowed opinions and their genuine understanding, so that authentic insight could finally emerge from within, rather than being handed over ready-made from outside. There is a specific and encouraging implication buried within this ancient distinction between knowledge and wisdom. If wisdom cannot simply be handed to you through information alone, then the absence of formal credentials, advanced degrees, or specialized training is not actually the barrier to genuine wisdom that modern culture often assumes it to be. A person with very little formal education can, through careful attention, honest self-examination, and sustained contemplative practice, develop genuine Sophia and genuine access to nous. Meanwhile, a person with extraordinary formal credentials can remain almost entirely trapped within doxa, mistaking their considerable knowledge for a wisdom they have never actually cultivated. Wisdom, in the ancient understanding, is available to anyone genuinely willing to do the specific inner work required to develop it, regardless of their starting position in life. As this chapter draws to a close, it is worth asking yourself honestly where the gap between knowledge and wisdom shows up most clearly in your own life right now. Perhaps there is an area where you already know quite clearly what would genuinely help you, and yet you consistently fail to act on that knowledge in any lasting way. This gap is not a sign of laziness or personal failure in the way modern self-criticism tends to frame it. It is simply the specific, ordinary evidence that knowledge alone is never sufficient, that genuine transformation requires the deeper perceptual shift that only nous, cultivated patiently over time, can ultimately provide. The chapters ahead will begin offering specific practices for cultivating exactly this deeper capacity, moving you gradually from the surface accumulation of information toward the genuine, lived wisdom the ancient philosophers spent their entire lives pursuing. Chapter 4. The Hidden Order Beneath Nature. Long before modern science developed its precise mathematical tools for describing the physical universe, the ancient Greek philosophers had already become convinced that nature was not chaotic or arbitrary, but was instead governed by a genuine, intelligible order. They called this underlying order the logos, a word that carries the combined sense of word, reason, and account, the specific rational structure that could, in principle, be understood and articulated by a sufficiently disciplined human mind. Heraclitus, writing in the 6th century before the Common Era, insisted that this logos was common to everyone, present everywhere, and yet almost entirely unnoticed by the average person going about their daily life. He compared most people to sleepwalkers, moving through a world genuinely full of intelligible pattern while remaining almost completely unaware of it. This ancient conviction that nature possesses a genuine hidden order was not simply a poetic flourish. It was a serious philosophical claim with enormous practical consequences, and it turned out, many centuries later, to be remarkably well supported by the discoveries of modern physics and mathematics. The specific mathematical relationships governing planetary motion, the precise ratios found in musical harmony, the elegant patterns visible in the growth of plants and shells, all of these were genuinely intuited by ancient thinkers long before they could be measured and confirmed with modern instruments. Pythagoras and his followers went so far as to claim that number itself was the fundamental substance of reality, that the entire cosmos was, at its deepest level, a kind of living mathematics. Whether or not every specific detail of Pythagorean number mysticism holds up to modern scrutiny, the underlying intuition that reality possesses a genuine mathematical and rational structure has proven to be one of the most productive ideas in the entire history of human thought. What makes this ancient insight so relevant to the specific themes of this audiobook is the claim that human nous is uniquely suited to perceiving this hidden natural order precisely because human reason and the logos of the universe are understood to share the same fundamental nature. In other words, the ancient philosophers did not believe that the human mind was some entirely separate and alien thing, awkwardly trying to understand a universe that operated on completely different principles. They believed the human mind was, at its deepest level, a genuine participant in the same intelligent order that structures the stars, the seasons, and the growth of every living thing. This is why Aristotle could confidently claim that nous, when functioning at its highest capacity, was the most godlike part of the human being, because it was the specific point of direct contact between the small individual mind and the vast intelligent order of the cosmos as a whole. This hidden order shows up not only in the grand movements of planets and the elegant patterns of mathematics, but also in the countless small, easily overlooked patterns of everyday experience. The specific rhythm of the seasons, the reliable cycle of growth and decay in every living thing, the consistent laws governing cause and effect in human behavior, all of these represent the same underlying logos, expressing itself at a smaller and more intimate scale. A person who has cultivated genuine nous begins to notice these smaller patterns with increasing clarity, the specific way certain choices reliably produce certain consequences, the specific way certain inner states reliably attract certain kinds of outer circumstances, the specific way genuine effort applied consistently over time reliably produces genuine results. None of this requires supernatural explanation. It simply requires the specific quality of attention that allows pattern, rather than isolated incident, to become visible. Most people, trapped within the noisy reactivity of doxa, experience their lives as a fairly random sequence of disconnected events, some fortunate and some unfortunate, with very little discernible relationship between them. This is precisely the sleepwalking condition Heraclitus described so many centuries ago. The specific shift that occurs when nous begins to awaken is not that the universe suddenly becomes more orderly than it was before. The universe was always orderly. What changes is the quality of perception available to notice that order. This is one of the most practically significant claims in this entire audiobook, because it means that the sense of confusion, randomness, and meaninglessness so many people carry through their daily lives is not primarily a feature of reality itself, but a specific, correctable limitation of the perceiving mind. The philosopher Plotinus, writing several centuries after Plato, in the tradition that came to be called Neoplatonism, developed this insight even further, describing a specific hierarchy of reality, extending from the purely physical world, through the realm of soul, through nous itself, and ultimately toward what he called the One, the single ultimate source from which all order and all being ultimately flow. Plotinus taught that the human soul, through careful contemplative practice, could gradually ascend this hierarchy, moving from scattered attention to the physical senses toward increasingly unified and increasingly clear perception through nous, and ultimately toward a direct, wordless contact with the One itself. This ascent was not for Plotinus an escape from ordinary life into some abstract, otherworldly realm. It was instead the specific process through which ordinary life became genuinely intelligible, its hidden order finally becoming visible to a mind that had learned how to look. There is a specific and practical takeaway embedded in this ancient teaching about hidden order that deserves direct attention. If the universe genuinely does possess an intelligible structure, and if the human mind genuinely does possess a faculty uniquely suited to perceiving that structure, then the specific practice of quieting the noisy reactive mind and cultivating patient, careful attention is not a purely private, self-improvement exercise disconnected from the larger world. It is a specific method for perceiving reality more accurately, for making decisions that are more genuinely aligned with how things actually work, rather than with the anxious, short-sighted assumptions of doxa. This is precisely why the ancient philosophers considered the cultivation of nous a matter of enormous practical urgency, not simply an abstract intellectual hobby reserved for leisure hours. As you move through the remainder of this audiobook, it is worth beginning to notice, gently and without forcing anything, the specific moments in your own life when a deeper pattern briefly becomes visible to you. Perhaps you have noticed a recurring theme in your relationships that seems to trace back to a single, unexamined belief. Perhaps you have noticed a specific rhythm in your own creative energy, a natural cycle of expansion and rest that your culture's relentless demand for constant productivity has taught you to override and ignore. These small moments of pattern recognition are not accidents. They are brief, genuine flashes of nous, quietly perceiving the hidden order that has been there all along. The chapters ahead will show you how to invite these flashes more consistently into your daily experience, until what once felt like rare insight becomes an increasingly reliable and increasingly available way of seeing. Chapter 5. How Perception Quietly Builds the World. You live in it is tempting to assume that perception simply reports the world as it already is, the way a mirror simply reflects whatever stands in front of it, without adding or subtracting anything. The ancient philosophers, along with a great deal of contemporary research into the workings of the human brain, arrived at a considerably more surprising conclusion. Perception does not merely report reality. Perception actively constructs the specific version of reality that any given mind actually experiences, filtering an overwhelming flood of raw sensory information through the specific expectations, beliefs, and habitual patterns that mind has already accumulated. Two people can stand in the exact same room, encounter the exact same events, and walk away with genuinely different experienced realities, not because the room or the events were different, but because the specific perceiving instrument each person brought to the encounter was different. Plato illustrated this insight with his famous allegory of the cave, a story already mentioned briefly in an earlier chapter, but worth returning to now with considerably more precision. The prisoners in the cave are chained in such a way that they can only see shadows cast on a wall in front of them. Shadows produced by objects and firelight positioned behind their backs, entirely outside their field of vision. Because the prisoners have never known anything else, they naturally assume the shadows are the whole of reality. When one prisoner is finally freed and turns around to see the actual objects casting the shadows, and eventually makes his way out of the cave entirely into the direct sunlight above, he undergoes a specific and genuinely difficult process of adjustment, because his entire prior perceptual framework has to be reconstructed from the ground up. This story is not simply about ignorance in some abstract sense. It is a precise description of how any habitual, unexamined perceptual framework can quietly convince a mind that its own limited version of reality is the entirety of what actually exists. The specific mechanism through which perception constructs rather than merely reports reality becomes considerably clearer when examined through the lens of ordinary daily experience. Consider two people receiving the exact same piece of difficult feedback from a supervisor at work. The first person, whose habitual perceptual framework has been shaped by years of harsh, unpredictable criticism during childhood, perceives the feedback as confirmation of a deep and painful belief that they are fundamentally inadequate. The second person, whose habitual perceptual framework was shaped by a more secure and encouraging early environment, perceives the exact same words as simply useful information, a specific opportunity to improve a specific skill, entirely disconnected from any judgment about their fundamental worth as a person. The words spoken were identical. The constructed experience of those words was almost completely different, because perception itself, shaped by each person's accumulated history, actively built two genuinely different realities from the same raw material. This is precisely where the distinction between doxa and nous becomes so practically significant, rather than remaining a purely abstract philosophical curiosity. The mind operating primarily through doxa perceives the world almost entirely through inherited, unexamined filters absorbed from parents, from culture, from painful past experience, without ever pausing to question whether those filters are actually producing an accurate picture of what is genuinely happening right now. The mind that has cultivated genuine access to nous develops the specific capacity to notice its own perceptual filters operating in real time, to recognize when a habitual interpretation is being automatically imposed on a new situation, and to gently set that habitual interpretation aside long enough to perceive what is actually freshly present. This is not a claim that perfect, filter-free perception is fully achievable for any human being. It is a claim that the degree of filtering can be substantially reduced through genuine, sustained practice. Aristotle's concept of the tabula rasa, the mind as a blank tablet at birth, gradually inscribed by experience, offers a useful complementary insight here. If the mind genuinely begins as something closer to a blank tablet, then the specific patterns later mistaken for permanent, unchangeable reality are, in fact, the accumulated inscriptions of a particular personal history. Inscriptions that could, in principle, be revised through new experience and new understanding. This is genuinely good news for anyone who has ever felt trapped by a persistent, painful way of seeing themselves or their circumstances. The specific painful pattern was written onto the tablet by particular experiences at a particular time. It was not carved into some permanent, unchangeable bedrock of reality. And what was written through experience can, with sufficient patience and sufficient genuine practice, eventually be revised through new experience, deliberately and consciously chosen. The Stoic philosophers developed a particularly practical approach to this insight. Through their concept of prohairesis, often translated as the faculty of choice or moral will, the specific human capacity to choose how to interpret and respond to any given external event. Epictetus, himself born into slavery, and therefore intimately familiar with circumstances almost entirely outside his personal control, taught that human beings are disturbed not by events themselves, but by their specific opinions about those events. This teaching is not a denial that painful events genuinely happen, nor a suggestion that painful events should simply be ignored or minimized. It is a precise observation that the specific interpretive layer added on top of raw events, the layer that perception constructs almost automatically, is where the actual experienced suffering primarily originates, and that this interpretive layer, unlike the raw external event itself, genuinely can be examined, questioned, and gradually revised. The specific practical implication of all this for someone genuinely seeking to access nous more reliably is considerable. If perception actively constructs experienced reality, rather than simply reporting some fixed external reality, then the deliberate cultivation of a clearer, less habitually filtered quality of perception becomes one of the single most powerful tools available for genuinely changing the felt quality of an entire life, without necessarily requiring any change in external circumstances at all. This is not a suggestion that external circumstances never matter or never need to change. It is a recognition that the specific relationship between a person and their circumstances, the meaning made, the interpretation constructed, the emotional response generated, is where the deepest and most immediately available leverage for genuine transformation actually resides. Nous, cultivated patiently, becomes the specific instrument through which this leverage is accessed. As this chapter comes to a close, consider setting aside, just for a few minutes today, one habitual interpretation you have been carrying about some specific, ongoing situation in your life. Perhaps it concerns a difficult relationship, a persistent financial worry, or a recurring pattern of self-doubt about your own capabilities. Rather than immediately trying to replace that interpretation with a falsely positive one, simply notice, with as much honesty as you can access, that this interpretation is one possible construction rather than the single, fixed, unquestionable truth of the situation. This small act of noticing, repeated patiently across many ordinary days, is precisely the kind of practice through which the ancient philosophers believed nous could be gradually, genuinely cultivated, until the deeper, clearer, less habitually filtered perception of reality becomes not a rare and occasional gift, but an increasingly natural and increasingly available way of meeting the world. Chapter 6. Why the wisest minds chose understanding over certainty. There is a specific and somewhat uncomfortable truth at the heart of ancient Greek philosophy that modern culture tends to avoid discussing directly. The wisest philosophers of the ancient world were not primarily interested in achieving quick, comfortable certainty about difficult questions. They were interested in something considerably more demanding and considerably more valuable: the patient, honest pursuit of genuine understanding, even when that pursuit required living for extended periods within uncertainty, ambiguity, and unresolved questions. Socrates was famously willing to spend an entire conversation, sometimes an entire day, patiently questioning a confident interlocutor's assumptions, gradually revealing the specific gaps and contradictions hidden beneath their apparent certainty, without ever rushing toward a comfortable, premature conclusion, simply to end the discomfort of the discussion. This willingness to remain in productive uncertainty stands in sharp contrast to the specific pattern most common in the mind of doxa, the ordinary reactive mind. This audiobook has already described at length. Doxa craves certainty, and it craves that certainty quickly, because uncertainty produces a specific and genuinely uncomfortable psychological state that the reactive mind is strongly motivated to escape as rapidly as possible. This is precisely why so many people leap toward the first available explanation for a difficult event, the first available diagnosis of a painful feeling, the first available solution to a complex problem, without pausing long enough to consider whether that first available answer is actually accurate or is simply the fastest available route back to psychological comfort. Nous, by contrast, is considerably more patient. It is willing to sit with a genuine question long enough for a genuinely accurate answer to emerge, rather than settling immediately for whatever answer happens to feel most immediately reassuring. Aristotle captured this specific distinction with a remark that has echoed through the history of philosophy ever since, observing that it is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without necessarily accepting it. This is a considerably more sophisticated capacity than it might initially appear. Most untrained minds move almost instantly from encountering an idea to either fully accepting or fully rejecting it, with very little genuine space held open for careful, patient examination in between. The capacity Aristotle is describing, the capacity to hold an idea at arm's length, to genuinely examine it from multiple angles, before deciding what to do with it, is precisely the kind of patient, disciplined attention that allows nous to eventually perceive what is genuinely true, rather than simply what feels immediately comfortable or immediately familiar. This preference for genuine understanding over premature certainty carries enormous practical consequences for how a person navigates the ordinary difficulties of daily life. Consider someone facing a genuinely complicated decision, perhaps whether to remain in a long-standing relationship or whether to leave a stable but unfulfilling career. The mind of Doxa, uncomfortable with the ambiguity of not yet knowing the right answer, will often manufacture a premature certainty, simply to relieve the discomfort of not knowing, latching on to whichever conclusion happens to align most closely with whatever fear or desire is loudest in that particular moment. The mind of nous, cultivated through patient practice, can remain genuinely present with the complexity of the situation for considerably longer, gathering more honest information, examining the situation from more angles, and ultimately arriving at a conclusion that reflects genuine understanding rather than simply the fastest available escape from discomfort. The ancient skeptic philosophers, a tradition that developed somewhat later than Plato and Aristotle, but drew on many of the same underlying concerns, took this preference for careful understanding to a particularly rigorous extreme. The skeptics practiced what they called epoche, a deliberate suspension of final judgment on questions where the available evidence remained genuinely inconclusive. This was not, as the term skeptic sometimes suggests, in casual modern usage, a cynical or dismissive attitude toward the possibility of genuine knowledge. It was instead a specific discipline of intellectual honesty, a refusal to claim more certainty than the actual evidence genuinely supported. The skeptics believed that this specific discipline of patient, honest suspension of judgment produced a particular quality of inner peace, what they called ataraxia, precisely because so much of ordinary human anxiety comes from clinging tightly to certainties that were never actually as solid as they initially appeared to be. There is a specific and important distinction worth making clear at this point between this genuine ancient discipline of patient understanding and the modern tendency toward endless, anxious rumination that never actually leads anywhere productive. The ancient philosophers were not recommending indecisive paralysis or the endless postponement of every necessary choice. They were recommending a specific quality of patient, honest attention applied for exactly as long as a given question genuinely required, followed by a genuine, committed decision once sufficient understanding had actually been reached. Nous, in this understanding, is not slower than doxa in some simple, uniform sense. It is precisely calibrated to the actual complexity of whatever question is at hand, moving quickly when quick clarity is genuinely available, and moving more slowly and more carefully when the underlying reality genuinely requires more patient examination before a trustworthy conclusion can be reached. The specific practical skill this chapter is inviting you to begin developing is this capacity to notice, in your own daily experience, the specific discomfort of not yet knowing something for certain, and to resist the immediate automatic urge to manufacture a premature answer simply to escape that discomfort. This is genuinely difficult because the discomfort of uncertainty is real, and the reactive mind has spent an entire lifetime perfecting its ability to escape that discomfort as quickly as possible. But every single time you notice this urge and choose, instead, to remain patiently present with a genuine question a little longer, you are directly practicing the specific discipline the ancient philosophers considered essential to the cultivation of nous. You are training your own mind to value genuine understanding over the shallow comfort of premature certainty. As this chapter closes, it is worth considering one specific area of your own life where you may have settled for a premature certainty that has never actually served you well. Perhaps it is a fixed belief about what you are capable of achieving, a belief adopted quickly years ago in response to a single difficult experience and never genuinely re-examined since. Perhaps it is a fixed conclusion about another person's character, formed instantly from a single interaction and never updated despite considerable evidence that might complicate that original impression. The invitation here is not to abandon every belief you currently hold. It is simply to notice with genuine honesty which of your current certainties were actually earned through patient understanding, and which were simply adopted quickly to escape the discomfort of not yet knowing. This noticing, practiced patiently, is precisely how the ancient philosophers believed the deeper clarity of nous could gradually be earned. Chapter 7. Consciousness, Reality, and the Question of What You Actually Are Buried within the ancient Greek understanding of nous is a specific and genuinely startling claim about the relationship between individual human consciousness and the larger structure of reality itself. The philosophers did not view the individual human mind as a small, isolated island of awareness, entirely separate from the rest of the universe, and merely observing it from a safe, external distance. They viewed nous, at its deepest and most fully realized level, as genuinely continuous with the larger intelligent order of the cosmos, a specific point where the universal logos becomes locally and personally aware of itself through a particular human being. This is a considerably more radical claim than it might initially sound, because it means that genuine self-knowledge and genuine knowledge of the universe are not, in the deepest sense, two separate pursuits at all, but are ultimately one and the same undertaking, approached from two apparently different directions. The inscription said to have been carved above the entrance to the Temple of Apollo at Delphi and captured this insight in a famously compressed phrase, Gnouthi Siauton, know thyself. This instruction was never intended as simple psychological self-help in the modern therapeutic sense, though it certainly includes and supports genuine psychological insight. It was understood by the ancient philosophers as an instruction of considerably greater cosmic significance, an invitation to discover, through careful and honest self-examination, the specific way in which one's own deepest nature, one's own nous, genuinely participates in and reflects the larger intelligent order of the universe as a whole. Socrates took this instruction with such seriousness that he built his entire philosophical method around it, believing that genuine self-knowledge was the necessary foundation for every other kind of genuine knowledge a human being could ever hope to acquire. This ancient conviction anticipates in a remarkable way certain themes that have re-emerged much later in the history of both physics and consciousness research. Contemporary physicists have long puzzled over the specific role that observation and measurement appear to play in determining the actual behavior of matter at the quantum level, a genuine and ongoing scientific puzzle that has led some serious researchers to wonder whether consciousness itself might play some more fundamental role in the structure of physical reality than the older, purely mechanical picture of the universe had assumed. The ancient Greek philosophers, working entirely without the mathematical tools of modern quantum physics, arrived at a related intuition through an entirely different route, through careful philosophical reflection on the specific nature of nous and its relationship to the deeper order of the cosmos. Whether or not the specific details of ancient metaphysics map precisely onto modern physics, the underlying intuition that consciousness and cosmic order are more intimately connected than a purely mechanical worldview would suggest, has proven remarkably durable across an extraordinary span of human intellectual history. Plotinus, whose broader philosophical system was already introduced briefly in an earlier chapter, developed this connection between individual consciousness and universal reality into one of the most sophisticated metaphysical systems ever constructed. In his understanding, the entire structure of reality unfolds as a specific series of emanations flowing outward from a single ultimate source he called the One, moving through nous, through soul, and finally into the material world of ordinary physical experience. The specific and remarkable claim Plotinus adds to this picture is that the human soul, through disciplined contemplative practice, can consciously retrace this entire emanation in reverse, moving from scattered attention to physical sensation, back through the increasingly unified perception of nous, and ultimately toward a direct, wordless encounter with the One itself, the same ultimate source from which the entire structure of reality originally emerged. This is not, for Plotinus, a claim about some distant future life. It is a claim about what becomes genuinely available to a sufficiently disciplined human consciousness within this present life. The specific practical significance of this cosmic dimension of nous for someone navigating ordinary daily existence is considerable, even if the full metaphysical system of Plotinus remains beyond what most people will ever formally study. If your own deepest consciousness genuinely participates in the larger intelligent order of the universe, then the specific quality of attention you bring to your own inner life is never merely a private, isolated undertaking with no larger significance. It is, in a very real sense, the specific place where the universe becomes locally aware of itself, examines itself, and potentially refines its own self-understanding through the particular vehicle of your own careful attention. This reframing carries a specific and genuinely encouraging implication. The patient inner work this audiobook has been describing throughout its previous chapters is not a small, merely personal project of self-improvement, disconnected from anything larger. It is a specific and meaningful participation in something considerably vaster than any single individual life. There is a particular danger worth naming honestly at this point in the discussion: the danger of using these genuinely profound cosmic ideas as an excuse for a kind of vague, ungrounded spiritual escapism that avoids the actual, concrete demands of ordinary daily life. The ancient philosophers who developed these ideas most carefully, Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus among them, were not recommending withdrawal from practical engagement with the world. Aristotle in particular insisted that genuine contemplative insight, however elevated, must eventually express itself through specific, concrete, practically wise action in the actual circumstances of an actual human life. Nous, properly understood, does not pull a person away from their genuine responsibilities and relationships. It deepens and clarifies the specific quality of attention brought to those responsibilities and relationships, allowing them to be met with considerably greater wisdom, patience, and genuine presence than the scattered, reactive mind of doxa could ever consistently provide. The specific practice this chapter invites you to consider is a brief, honest inquiry into the actual nature of your own awareness, conducted not as an abstract philosophical exercise, but as a direct, personal investigation. In a quiet moment, simply notice that you are aware, that there is a specific quality of consciousness present right now. Reading these words prior to and beneath any specific thought about what the words mean. This bare awareness, prior to interpretation and commentary, is considerably closer to the ancient philosophers' understanding of nous than the busy, chattering, opinion-generating mind that usually dominates ordinary attention. Simply resting, even briefly, in this quieter quality of awareness, without immediately rushing to analyze or explain it, is itself a genuine and direct practice of the specific faculty this entire audiobook has been exploring. As this chapter comes to its close, consider carrying forward a specific and quietly transformative question into the remainder of your ordinary day. What might change in how you meet a difficult moment, a demanding conversation, or a routine task if you genuinely considered your own attention in that moment as a meaningful participation in a larger, intelligent order, rather than as an isolated, insignificant flicker of private experience with no larger connection to anything beyond itself? This is not a question with a single correct answer to be memorized and repeated. It is an invitation to notice gradually and patiently how this larger frame might quietly begin to change the specific quality of presence you bring to even the smallest and most ordinary moments of your daily life. Chapter 8. Plato's Cave, Revisited for the Modern Mind. Plato's allegory of the cave has already been mentioned twice in earlier chapters, but its full depth deserves a chapter of careful, dedicated attention on its own, because this single ancient image contains in remarkably compressed form nearly the entire argument this audiobook has been developing. Picture, once again, a group of prisoners chained since childhood deep inside a cave, positioned so they can only ever look forward at a blank wall in front of them. Behind these prisoners, a fire burns steadily, and between the fire and the prisoners, unseen puppeteers walk back and forth, carrying various objects and figures. Casting flickering shadows onto the wall, the prisoners are forced to watch. Because the prisoners have never known any other experience, they naturally come to believe that these flickering shadows constitute the entirety of reality. They even develop an elaborate system for predicting which shadows will appear next, and they honor, among themselves, whoever becomes most skilled at this particular game of shadow prediction. This detail about the prisoners honoring skillful shadow prediction deserves particular attention because it maps with uncomfortable precision onto specific patterns visible throughout modern life. Enormous social status, in many contemporary contexts, is awarded to people who have become extremely skilled at predicting and manipulating the specific shadows cast within a narrow, unexamined system, whether that system involves financial markets, social media trends, competitive career advancement, or any number of other domains where genuine underlying reality is rarely questioned and only the surface patterns are ever actually studied. Plato's ancient image suggests that this kind of skill, however genuinely impressive within its own narrow domain, is not the same thing as wisdom, and it is certainly not the same thing as genuine nous. It is simply a considerably more sophisticated form of doxa, mastery over shadows, rather than genuine contact with the deeper reality those shadows merely reflect. Now imagine, as Plato asks his readers to imagine, that one particular prisoner is somehow freed from these chains and forced to turn around. This turning is genuinely painful and disorienting at first, because the direct light of the fire, after a lifetime spent watching only shadows, is initially overwhelming and difficult to look at directly. The freed prisoner does not immediately experience this new perspective as a welcome liberation. His first response is often confusion, discomfort, and even a longing to return to the familiar, comfortable darkness of the shadows he had always known. This detail is crucial because it accurately predicts a specific and genuinely common human response to the early stages of authentic inner growth. The initial encounter with a clearer, more accurate perception of reality frequently feels considerably more uncomfortable than the familiar, comfortable illusion it is gradually replacing. And this discomfort causes many people to retreat back toward their original chains rather than continuing the difficult journey forward. Plato continues the story further, describing how the freed prisoner is eventually led out of the cave entirely, into the direct sunlight above ground, an experience that is initially even more overwhelming and disorienting than the fire had been. Only gradually, over considerable time, does the freed prisoner's eyes adjust sufficiently to look first at shadows and reflections in the world above, then at the actual objects themselves, and finally, after this gradual and patient adjustment, at the sun itself, which Plato uses as his specific image for the ultimate source of all genuine truth and understanding. This gradual, patient adjustment is precisely the process this audiobook has been describing throughout its earlier chapters. The slow, sustained cultivation of nous, moving step by step from the comfortable but limited shadows of doxa toward increasingly direct and increasingly clear perception of genuine reality. The final and perhaps most challenging portion of Plato's allegory describes what happens when the freed prisoner, having finally adjusted to the genuine light above ground, chooses to return to the cave in order to help free the other prisoners, still chained there. Because his eyes have now adjusted to bright sunlight, he initially struggles to see clearly in the cave's familiar darkness, stumbling and appearing considerably less skilled at the shadow prediction game than he once was. The other prisoners, observing this apparent decline in his former abilities, conclude that his journey outside the cave has actually damaged him. And Plato notes soberly that they might even attempt to kill anyone who tried to free them from their chains and lead them toward the same difficult, disorienting journey he had undergone. This detail carries a specific and important warning for anyone genuinely committed to the cultivation of nous. Deeper understanding is not always welcomed by those still comfortable within their existing familiar shadows, and the specific work of genuine inner growth sometimes requires a willingness to be misunderstood, at least temporarily, by people who have not yet begun their own version of this same difficult journey. It is worth pausing to consider the specific contemporary equivalents of Plato's cave that shape modern experience just as powerfully as the ancient allegory once shaped Athenian philosophical discussion. The constant stream of curated images and opinions flowing through modern digital media functions, for many people, in remarkably similar ways to the flickering shadows on Plato's cave wall. An endlessly compelling but ultimately superficial representation of reality that can easily be mistaken for reality itself if never carefully questioned. The specific cultural scripts inherited from family, community, and broader society about what a successful, meaningful, worthwhile life must necessarily look like function. For many people, as another set of shadows, projected so early and so consistently that their constructed contingent nature is rarely, if ever, questioned. Recognizing these modern equivalents of Plato's ancient image is itself a genuine act of nous, a specific instance of turning around, at least partially, to notice the mechanism casting the shadows rather than remaining entirely absorbed in watching the shadows themselves. There is a specific and encouraging note worth adding to this ancient story before moving forward. Plato's allegory can sound, on first encounter, somewhat bleak, suggesting that only a rare handful of prisoners will ever manage to escape their chains, while the vast majority remain trapped indefinitely within their comfortable illusions. But the ancient philosophical tradition as a whole, including Plato's own broader body of work, consistently held that every human soul possesses the same fundamental capacity for nous, regardless of how deeply chained in shadows that particular soul might currently appear to be. The chains described in the allegory are not permanent, unchangeable features of human nature. They are the specific, contingent result of habit, upbringing, and unexamined cultural inheritance, and precisely because they are contingent rather than fixed, they genuinely can be loosened. Gradually, through the specific kind of patient, sustained inner practice. This audiobook continues to describe throughout its remaining chapters. As this chapter closes, consider identifying with as much honesty as you can access, one specific shadow currently occupying an unusually large portion of your own attention, whether it involves a particular fear about the future, a particular comparison to someone else's apparent success, or a particular story about your own limitations that has never actually been carefully examined. You are not being asked to solve or dismiss this shadow immediately. You are simply being invited to turn, even briefly, and notice that it is in fact a shadow, a specific projection cast by a particular mechanism, rather than an unquestionable, permanent feature of reality itself. This single small turning, repeated patiently across many ordinary days, is precisely the beginning of the journey Plato described so vividly more than 2,000 years ago, and it remains, even now, the beginning of every genuine journey toward the deeper clarity of nous. Chapter 9. The daily practices that quiet the noisy mind. Having spent the previous chapters establishing the ancient philosophical foundation for the distinction between doxa and nous, this chapter turns toward the specific, practical question of how this deeper faculty can actually be cultivated within the genuine constraints of an ordinary modern life, full of work responsibilities, relationships, and the countless small demands of daily existence. The ancient philosophical schools did not consider nous something that simply arrived through intellectual understanding alone. However genuinely valuable that understanding is as a starting foundation, they developed specific discipline practices, refined and tested across many generations, precisely because they recognized that genuine transformation requires more than merely grasping an idea intellectually. It requires the patient, repeated, embodied practice through which that idea gradually becomes a genuinely lived and genuinely reliable capacity. The single most consistently emphasized practice across nearly every branch of ancient philosophy was some specific form of disciplined attention to the present moment, stripped as much as possible of the habitual mental chatter that ordinarily fills nearly every waking hour. The Stoics practiced a specific evening exercise of reviewing the events of the day with careful, honest attention, examining exactly where their own judgments and interpretations, rather than external events themselves, had produced unnecessary suffering, and considering how a wiser response might have looked instead. This was not a practice of harsh self-criticism, but of patient, honest self-observation, gradually training the mind to notice its own habitual patterns of interpretation with increasing clarity. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor whose personal journal survives as one of the most beloved works of Stoic philosophy, used this exact practice consistently throughout his own extraordinarily demanding daily responsibilities, proving that such practices are genuinely compatible with an active, engaged, practically demanding life, rather than requiring withdrawal into isolated contemplation. A second consistently emphasized ancient practice involved deliberate, structured periods of genuine silence and solitude, understood not as escapism from responsibility, but as necessary maintenance for the deeper faculty of nous, in much the same way that physical rest is necessary maintenance for the physical body. Pythagoras reportedly required his own students to observe extended periods of complete silence as part of their philosophical training, believing that the constant habit of speaking, reacting, and verbally processing every passing thought actively prevented the quieter, deeper faculty of genuine perception from ever having sufficient space to operate. This is not a suggestion that ordinary conversation and social engagement are somehow harmful or should be avoided entirely. It is a specific recognition that a mind constantly filled with outward speech and constant external stimulation rarely has sufficient quiet space remaining for the considerably subtler activity of nous to become genuinely audible above the surrounding noise. A third practice worth specific attention is the deliberate cultivation of what might be called productive questioning, modeled directly on the Socratic method already discussed in an earlier chapter. This practice involves regularly and honestly questioning your own automatic assumptions and interpretations, particularly in moments of strong emotional reaction, rather than simply accepting those automatic reactions as accurate, unquestionable reports of reality. When a strong feeling of anger, anxiety, or hurt arises in response to a specific situation, the practice involves pausing, even briefly, to ask a series of honest questions. What specific interpretation am I currently making about this situation? Is this interpretation the only reasonable one available, or simply the most immediately familiar one? What would this same situation look like if I set aside my most immediate, habitual reaction and looked at it freshly, as though encountering it for the very first time? These questions, asked with genuine honesty rather than as a mechanical exercise, gradually create the specific inner space within which nous can begin to operate. The fourth practice, and perhaps the most immediately accessible for someone new to this entire body of work, involves the deliberate cultivation of careful, sustained attention to ordinary sensory experience, an ancient precursor to what contemporary psychology now often calls mindfulness. Rather than moving through daily activities on complete mental autopilot, dominated entirely by internal chatter and habitual reaction, this practice involves periodically bringing full, genuine attention to whatever is immediately present, the specific sensation of breath moving in and out of the body, the specific sounds present in the immediate environment, the specific physical sensations involved in a routine task like washing dishes or walking across a room. This practice may initially seem entirely unrelated to the lofty philosophical concerns of earlier chapters, but the ancient philosophers understood it as foundational, precisely because a mind that has not learned to attend carefully to simple, immediate, sensory reality is unlikely to develop the considerably subtler capacity required to perceive the deeper patterns and hidden order this audiobook has been exploring throughout. It is worth directly addressing a specific concern that often arises when modern people first encounter these ancient practices, the concern that such practices require an unrealistic amount of free time or an unusually contemplative lifestyle not genuinely available to someone managing a demanding career, raising children, or navigating any of the countless other practical responsibilities that fill an ordinary modern life. The ancient philosophers themselves, many of whom held demanding public positions, raised families, and managed considerable practical responsibilities of their own, consistently emphasized that these practices could be woven into the existing fabric of an active life, rather than requiring separate, extended periods of isolated withdrawal. A brief moment of honest self-questioning during a difficult conversation, several conscious breaths taken before responding to a stressful email, a few minutes of genuine quiet reflection at the end of an otherwise demanding day. These small, genuinely accessible practices, repeated consistently over time, produce considerably more genuine transformation than an occasional, elaborate retreat undertaken once a year and then largely forgotten. There is a specific and important point worth emphasizing about the cumulative nature of these practices, a point the ancient philosophers understood clearly even without the benefit of the modern neuroscience to confirm it. No single instance of quiet attention, honest self-questioning, or careful presence produces dramatic, permanent transformation on its own. The genuine cultivation of nous occurs gradually through the patient accumulation of many small moments of practice repeated consistently across weeks, months, and years, in much the same way that physical strength develops gradually through consistent exercise rather than through any single isolated workout. This is genuinely encouraging news for anyone who might feel discouraged after a single attempt at one of these practices fails to produce immediate, dramatic results. The ancient philosophers were not promising instant transformation. They were describing a patient, lifelong practice, one that becomes increasingly natural and increasingly rewarding the longer it is genuinely sustained. As this chapter closes, consider selecting just one of the 4 practices described here, whichever one feels most genuinely accessible given your own current circumstances and temperament, and committing to a small, specific, realistic version of that practice for the coming week. This might mean 5 minutes of genuine quiet reflection each evening, 3 conscious breaths taken before each difficult conversation, or a single honest question, asked of yourself each time a strong emotional reaction arises. The specific practice you choose matters considerably less than the consistency with which you actually engage it. The ancient philosophers understood with remarkable clarity that the deeper faculty of nous responds not to occasional dramatic effort, but to patient, humble, consistent practice, sustained gently over time, until what once required deliberate effort gradually becomes a natural and increasingly reliable way of meeting each new day. Chapter 10. What changes when you actually stop following the crowd? Every human community, from the smallest family unit to the largest nation, generates a specific and powerful gravitational pull toward shared, collective thinking. A pull the ancient Greeks understood clearly through their concept of doxa, and that modern social psychology has since documented through extensive, careful research into conformity and social pressure. This gravitational pull is not in itself either entirely good or entirely bad. It serves genuinely important functions, allowing large groups of people to coordinate effectively, to share useful accumulated knowledge, and to maintain the kind of social cohesion necessary for any community to function at all. But this same gravitational pull, when it goes entirely unquestioned and unexamined, quietly prevents the deeper faculty of nous from ever developing its own genuine, independent voice, because the constant, comfortable pressure to think and believe whatever the surrounding group already thinks and believes leaves remarkably little room for the patient, careful, sometimes solitary process through which genuine wisdom is actually cultivated. The specific title of this audiobook makes a bold and precise promise that everything you genuinely want becomes available the moment you stop thinking like everyone else. This promise deserves careful, honest examination rather than simple, uncritical acceptance, because it is easy to misunderstand in ways that lead to genuinely unhelpful conclusions. The promise is not suggesting that simple contrarianism, the automatic reflexive habit of believing the opposite of whatever the crowd currently believes, constitutes genuine access to nous. Reflexive contrarianism is, in fact, simply another form of doxa, just as thoroughly determined by the surrounding crowd's opinions as straightforward conformity, only inverted rather than genuinely independent. Genuine nous is not defined by its relationship to what the crowd currently believes at all. It is defined by its direct, careful, patient contact with the actual underlying pattern and structure of reality, regardless of whether that contact happens to align with or diverge from popular opinion in any given moment. What actually changes, then, when a person genuinely develops access to nous, rather than simply adopting either automatic conformity or automatic rebellion against the surrounding crowd? The most immediate and significant change involves the specific quality of decision-making available to that person. Someone operating primarily through doxa makes decisions largely by scanning the surrounding social environment for cues about what is generally considered acceptable, desirable, or safe, and then adjusting their own choices to align with those cues, often without ever pausing to examine whether those inherited cues actually serve their own genuine, deeper well-being. Someone who has genuinely cultivated access to nous can still take social context carefully into account, because nous is not opposed to genuine wisdom about how other people think and feel, but the final decision emerges from a considerably deeper and more careful process of genuine discernment, rather than from simple, automatic social matching. This shift produces specific and observable changes across nearly every domain of ordinary life, beginning with career and financial decisions. The mind of doxa tends to pursue whatever the surrounding culture currently defines as prestigious or successful, often without ever pausing to ask whether that particular definition of success genuinely aligns with one's own deepest values and genuine capacities. The mind of nous, cultivated patiently, becomes considerably more capable of perceiving the specific, genuine fit between a particular path and one's own actual nature, sometimes leading toward choices the surrounding crowd finds difficult to understand or even actively discourages, and sometimes, perhaps surprisingly, leading right back toward entirely conventional choices, but chosen now from genuine understanding rather than from unexamined social pressure. The specific external choice matters considerably less in this framework than the internal quality of clarity from which that choice actually emerges. The shift from doxa toward nous produces equally significant changes within the domain of personal relationships. Many people, operating largely from unexamined doxa, choose romantic partners, close friendships, and even the specific quality of relationship they maintain with their own family members based largely on inherited scripts about what these relationships are supposed to look like. Scripts absorbed early in life and rarely examined with genuine honesty afterward. A person who has cultivated genuine access to nous develops the specific capacity to perceive each particular relationship with considerably greater clarity, noticing what is genuinely nourishing and what is genuinely depleting, independent of whatever inherited script might suggest that relationship should feel or look like. This often produces the specific, sometimes difficult work of gradually revising certain long-standing relational patterns, not out of rebellion for its own sake, but out of genuine, patient discernment about what actually serves genuine flourishing. There is a particular domain worth examining with special care: the specific relationship between nous and genuine material abundance, because this connects directly to the practical promise embedded in this audiobook's title. The mind of doxa approaches financial and material matters largely through comparison, anxiety, and the specific, exhausting effort of trying to keep pace with an ever-shifting, externally defined standard of what constitutes enough. This approach, however much energy is poured into it, rarely produces a genuine, lasting sense of sufficiency, because the specific goalposts defining enough are perpetually being reset by comparison with whatever the surrounding crowd happens to be pursuing at any given moment. The mind of nous approaches the same material questions from a considerably different foundation, perceiving more clearly what is genuinely needed for a genuinely well-lived life. Distinguishing this clearly from the endless, comparison-driven wanting that doxo generates almost automatically, and this clearer perception frequently produces both more genuine contentment and, somewhat paradoxically, more effective and more sustainable practical action toward genuine material well-being. It is worth directly acknowledging a specific and genuine difficulty involved in this entire process: the specific social discomfort that sometimes accompanies a genuine shift away from unexamined doxa toward the considerably more independent perception of nous. Plato's allegory of the cave, examined carefully in an earlier chapter, already warned that those still comfortable within their familiar shadows do not always welcome someone who has begun to see more clearly. Friends, family members, and colleagues who remain comfortably embedded within shared, unexamined assumptions may respond to your gradually shifting perception with confusion, discomfort, or even active resistance, particularly if your changing choices implicitly call their own unexamined choices into question. This difficulty is genuinely real, and it deserves honest acknowledgement rather than a falsely cheerful dismissal, though it is also worth noting that genuine nous, properly cultivated, tends to produce considerably more patience and compassion toward others still comfortably embedded in doxa, rather than the specific contempt or superiority that a merely intellectual, unearned sense of independence sometimes produces instead. As this chapter closes, consider identifying one specific area of your own life where you suspect your current choices are being driven primarily by unexamined social comparison or inherited expectation, rather than by genuine, careful discernment about what actually serves your own deepest flourishing. This might involve a career path pursued largely because it appears impressive to others, a specific lifestyle choice adopted mainly to match a particular social circle, or a persistent, low-grade anxiety about not measuring up to some external standard you have never actually paused to examine with genuine honesty. You are not being asked to immediately overturn this entire area of your life. You are simply being invited to bring the patient, careful attention this audiobook has been describing throughout its previous chapters to this one specific domain, allowing genuine nous, rather than automatic doxa, the opportunity to gradually clarify what actually, genuinely serves you. Chapter 11. Living from nous in an ordinary week. It is one thing to understand, intellectually, the distinction between doxa and nous, and to appreciate the specific philosophical practices the ancient tradition developed for cultivating this deeper faculty. It is a considerably different and more demanding matter to actually integrate this understanding into the genuine texture of an ordinary week, filled with early alarms, demanding commutes, difficult meetings, household responsibilities, and the countless small frictions that constitute most people's actual daily experience. This chapter is specifically devoted to that practical integration, walking through several common, ordinary situations and examining in concrete detail how the presence or absence of genuine nous might shape the specific way each situation unfolds. The goal here is not to provide a rigid, mechanical formula to be applied identically in every circumstance, but to illustrate, through specific example, the genuinely different quality of engagement that becomes available as nous is gradually, patiently cultivated. Consider first the specific experience of waking up to an already demanding morning, running slightly behind schedule, with a full and pressing list of responsibilities awaiting immediate attention. The mind of Doxa typically meets this situation with an immediate surge of anxious urgency, a specific mental narration already rehearsing every way the day might go wrong, borrowed almost entirely from the general cultural anxiety surrounding productivity and time management that most people have absorbed without ever consciously choosing it. The mind that has begun cultivating genuine nous meets the exact same practical circumstances with a considerably different internal quality, still moving efficiently and still genuinely attending to the practical demands of the morning, but without the additional layer of borrowed anxious narration piled on top of the simple practical facts. The specific tasks remain identical in both cases. The internal experience of moving through them is genuinely, significantly different. Consider next a specific, moderately difficult conversation with a colleague or family member, involving some degree of disagreement or tension. The mind of Doxa tends to enter such conversations already partially rehearsing its own defensive responses, already anticipating conflict based on similar difficult conversations from the past, and often projecting onto the current. Specific person patterns of interpretation borrowed wholesale from entirely different relationships and different circumstances. This is precisely the mechanism through which Doxa quietly generates far more conflict than the actual present circumstances genuinely warrant. The mind that has cultivated genuine access to nous enters the same conversation with a specific quality of fresh, careful attention, genuinely curious about what this particular person is actually communicating in this particular moment, rather than automatically overlaying inherited assumptions from unrelated past experiences. This single shift, seemingly small, frequently transforms the entire trajectory and outcome of an otherwise difficult exchange. Consider, too, the specific experience of receiving unexpected, disappointing news, whether a financial setback, a missed opportunity, or some other form of ordinary life disruption. The reactive mind of Doxa typically responds with an immediate, automatic narrative of catastrophe, borrowing heavily from the specific patterns of worst-case thinking that most people have inherited from a culture generally oriented toward scarcity and threat. The mind cultivating genuine nous is capable not of denying the genuine difficulty of the disappointing news, but of holding that difficulty within a considerably wider frame. The specific frame this audiobook has already described in earlier chapters. The frame capable of perceiving the larger pattern unfolding across time, rather than reacting solely to the immediate, isolated event. This wider frame does not eliminate genuine disappointment, but it consistently prevents that genuine disappointment from spiraling into the kind of prolonged, catastrophizing suffering that doxa so reliably generates when left entirely unquestioned. It is worth examining, as well, the specific quality of ordinary, unremarkable moments, the quiet stretches of a day that involve no particular crisis or challenge at all, simply routine tasks like preparing a meal, commuting between destinations, or completing familiar household chores. The mind of doxa typically treats these ordinary moments as essentially empty, filling them automatically with restless mental chatter, worry about the future, or replaying of past events, rarely bringing any genuine quality of attention to the actual, immediate, present moment unfolding. The mind cultivating genuine nous, drawing on the practices described in the previous chapter, begins treating these ordinary moments as genuine opportunities for the kind of quiet, sustained attention through which deeper perception is patiently cultivated. This does not mean every ordinary task must become an elaborate, formal meditation. It simply means that the countless small, unremarkable moments filling most ordinary days become considerably richer, considerably more genuinely lived, rather than being treated as mere gaps to be filled with restless distraction while waiting for something more significant to happen. The specific cumulative effect of consistently bringing this quality of attention across an entire, ordinary week is considerably more significant than it might initially appear from any single individual instance. A person who has genuinely begun shifting from habitual doxa toward cultivated nous does not typically experience one single, dramatic, life-altering transformation. Instead, they gradually notice a specific accumulation of smaller shifts, slightly less reactive anger in difficult conversations, slightly clearer perception in complicated decisions, slightly less anxious narration during ordinary daily transitions, slightly richer presence during otherwise unremarkable moments. These smaller shifts, individually modest, compound considerably over time, in much the same way that small, consistent financial contributions compound into substantial wealth across many years. The genuine promise embedded in this audiobook's title is not a promise of instant, effortless transformation. It is a promise about the specific, considerable cumulative power of patient, consistent practice sustained across the genuine texture of ordinary weeks, months, and years. There is a specific caution worth including at this point in the discussion, a caution against the particular trap of treating this entire practice as another demanding item to be perfectly optimized, another source of anxious self-criticism, whenever a given day inevitably falls short of the ideal being described here. The cultivation of nous is not a competition, and it does not proceed through harsh self-judgment whenever the habitual, reactive mind of doxa reasserts itself, as it inevitably and repeatedly will, especially in the early stages of this practice. The ancient philosophers themselves, careful and rigorous as their disciplines genuinely were, consistently emphasized patience and genuine self-compassion as essential companions to disciplined practice, understanding clearly that harsh self-criticism is itself simply another product of doxa, another borrowed, culturally inherited pattern that tends to entrench the very reactivity it claims to be correcting. As this chapter closes, consider choosing one single, upcoming, ordinary situation from your own week ahead whether a demanding morning, a difficult conversation, an unwelcome piece of news, or simply a routine, unremarkable task, and deliberately bringing to that one specific situation the quality of patient, careful attention this chapter has been describing. You do not need to attempt this shift across your entire week all at once. A single, genuine instance of choosing nous over automatic doxa, noticed clearly and held with patient attention, is itself a genuine and meaningful practice. Precisely the kind of small, consistent effort through which the ancient philosophers believed this deeper faculty could gradually, reliably be strengthened across an entire lifetime. Chapter 12. The life that belongs to those who think for themselves. Across the 11 chapters that came before this one, this audiobook has traced a specific and ancient distinction between two fundamentally different qualities of mind. The noisy, reactive, borrowed thinking the Greeks called doxa, and the quieter, deeper, genuinely perceptive faculty they called nous. This final chapter is an invitation to consider, directly and honestly, what kind of life genuinely becomes available to someone who has patiently, consistently cultivated this deeper faculty across the ordinary texture of daily existence, not as an abstract philosophical achievement admired from a distance, but as a genuinely lived, genuinely embodied way of meeting each new day. The ancient philosophers were remarkably consistent in describing this life not primarily in terms of dramatic, external transformation, but in terms of a specific, considerable inner clarity and stability that then naturally expressed itself outward into every domain of practical, everyday experience. The financial and material dimension of this life, already touched on briefly in an earlier chapter, deserves further attention here, as this audiobook draws toward its close. A person who has genuinely cultivated nous approaches material questions from a foundation of clear perception rather than anxious, comparison-driven reaction, distinguishing with considerably greater precision between genuine need and borrowed, culturally inherited wanting. This clarity frequently produces more effective, practical decision-making because decisions made from clear perception rather than from anxious reactivity tend, quite naturally, to be better calibrated to actual circumstances and actual long-term consequences. It also produces a specific and genuine quality of contentment that exists somewhat independently of any particular external outcome, because the deepest source of that contentment was never actually located in the external circumstance itself, but in the clarity of perception a person brings to whatever circumstance happens to be genuinely present. The relational dimension of this life is equally significant and deserves equally careful attention. A person who has genuinely cultivated nous relates to other people with a specific quality of presence and genuine curiosity that the habitual, reactive patterns of doxa rarely allow, because so much of ordinary relational difficulty stems directly from projecting inherited assumptions and past patterns onto people and situations that are, in fact, genuinely new and genuinely different. This does not mean every relationship automatically becomes easy or are conflict-free, because genuine differences between people are real and sometimes genuinely difficult to navigate regardless of the quality of perception either person brings to the encounter. It means instead that whatever genuine difficulty does arise within relationships is met with considerably greater clarity, patience, and honest discernment, producing relationships that are, on the whole, considerably more genuinely nourishing than relationships conducted almost entirely through the unexamined reactivity of doxa. The creative and professional dimension of this life carries its own specific significance. Aristotle's concept of phronesis, practical wisdom, discussed in an earlier chapter, describes precisely the specific capacity that flourishes as nous is patiently cultivated. The capacity to perceive clearly what a particular situation genuinely calls for, rather than mechanically applying inherited rules or borrowed strategies that may not actually fit the specific circumstances at hand. This capacity produces work of considerably greater genuine quality and genuine originality, because work produced from clear perception of an actual specific situation tends to be considerably more responsive and considerably more genuinely useful than work produced from generic, borrowed formulas applied without careful thought. Many of history's most celebrated creative and intellectual achievements emerged precisely from this specific capacity to perceive something genuine and specific that the surrounding crowd, comfortable within its own doxa, had simply never noticed. There is a specific and important point worth making about the relationship between this deeper clarity and genuine peace of mind, a connection the ancient Stoics, in particular, emphasized with remarkable consistency across their entire body of philosophical work. Much of the chronic, low-grade anxiety that characterizes so much of modern experience stems not primarily from the actual, objective difficulty of present circumstances, considerable as that difficulty sometimes genuinely is, but from the additional, unexamined layer of anxious, comparison-driven, catastrophizing interpretation that doxa reliably adds on top of whatever circumstances are genuinely present. As nous is patiently cultivated, this additional interpretive layer gradually thins, not because genuine difficulties magically disappear, but because they are increasingly met with considerably clearer, considerably more accurate perception, unburdened by the specific distortions that reactive borrowed thinking so consistently introduces. This produces a specific and genuine quality of peace that has nothing to do with denial or avoidance, and everything to do with simply seeing more clearly. It is worth returning one final time to the specific promise embedded in this audiobook's title. The claim that everything you genuinely want becomes available the moment you stop thinking like everyone else. Having traced this claim carefully across 11 previous chapters, it should now be clear that this promise was never suggesting some magical, effortless shortcut to material acquisition. It was describing, with considerable precision, the genuine and reliable relationship between the quality of a mind's perception and the quality of life that naturally, organically unfolds from that perception. A mind still entirely governed by doxa generates narrow, fearful, comparison-driven choices, and from those narrow choices, a correspondingly narrow range of actual outcomes reliably follows. A mind that has genuinely cultivated access to nous generates considerably wider, clearer, more genuinely discerning choices, and from that wider perception, a correspondingly wider and considerably more genuinely satisfying range of outcomes becomes available, not through magic, but through the direct, observable, entirely natural consequences of seeing more clearly and choosing more wisely. As this audiobook draws toward its final close, it is worth acknowledging honestly that the journey this book has described is not one that concludes neatly at the end of 12 chapters. The ancient philosophers who first articulated this distinction between doxa and nous considered the cultivation of this deeper faculty a lifelong pursuit, one that continued to deepen and mature across an entire human lifespan, never reaching some final, complete state of permanent achievement, after which further growth becomes unnecessary. This is not discouraging news. It is, in fact, one of the most genuinely hopeful aspects of the entire tradition this audiobook has been exploring, because it means the specific, patient work available to you starting today is genuinely available to you again tomorrow, and the day after that, and across every ordinary day that follows, each one offering fresh opportunity to notice the difference between borrowed reaction and genuine perception, and to gently, patiently choose the deeper faculty the ancient Greeks so rightly considered among the most precious capacities available to any human being. You did not encounter this particular audiobook with this particular ancient teaching entirely by accident. Something in you was genuinely ready to hear this specific distinction between the noisy, borrowed mind almost everyone lives inside, and the quieter, deeper, considerably wiser faculty that has been patiently waiting this entire time for your genuine attention. The specific practices this audiobook has described, patient reflection, disciplined silence, honest self-questioning, and careful attention to ordinary sensory experience, are not complicated or inaccessible. They are simply patient, and they require nothing more than your genuine, consistent willingness to keep returning to them, day after ordinary day. The ancient Greeks called this deeper faculty nous, and they believed with genuine conviction that it belonged to every human soul as a birthright, rather than a rare exception. What remains now is simply the patient, lifelong practice of claiming it as genuinely your own.